I'm out in the shop tonight and I want to talk about a subject that I don't think I've talked about on any of my videos before, at least not to any degree, and that's sanding scroll saw projects. I was out in the shop over last weekend just cleaning up, and I happened to notice that I have a lot of tools and a lot of little instruments dedicated to sanding. And I thought I'd just take you through some of those, show you how much I use what, and so if you're just getting started in the scroll saw world, this might be helpful to you to give you an idea of what you need, what you maybe don't need but it's nice to have, and what you probably just don't need. I think I'll start out talking about non-power type sanding tools that you can use to basically get yourself started. But before we do that, let's talk about why you need to sand certain scroll saw projects. A lot of times once you've completed your cut, and again this is just an example here, when you turn it over on the back, even if you're using a scroll reverse blade, which reduces the amount of sanding you need to do, you'll end up having a lot of tear out on the back side of your cut. And I'm going to scroll in here just a little bit, and you can see if you look closely here that there's some tear out around the places where I cut this pattern out. So it's probably a little hard to see, but that's probably the number one thing that you end up sanding out on a scroll saw project. Of course, a lot of times you'll also want to ease the edges of a pattern once you have it cut. For instance, this little name sign here, when you get done, you might not want to have the sharp edges, so you need some way of easing all these curves. And on a scroll saw project where you have all these uneven edges, it can be hard to do. So those are a couple of the situations, and of course also before you apply your finish, a lot of times you'll want to smooth the surface of the wood out a little bit also. So that's why we would need to do some sanding. Of course, you're going to start with just, the old hand method of some sandpaper and your fingers, and you want to try to buy the best quality sandpaper you can buy. It'll last a lot longer, it won't clog as quick, and you'll just in general get better results out of it. So I buy sandpaper by the sheets, and I sometimes will buy it in the big box stores, but sometimes I also will order it online. And I generally don't use a sheet this size. I'll end up cutting it down to a more manageable size that I need. A lot of times when I cut the sandpaper, I'll cut it into small strips like this, and then I'll take and fold that small strip over where it kind of gives me a double-edged side there, and then I'll use that to get inside these edges of the pattern and sand away those fuzzies. I occasionally will also take a popsicle stick or just any little craft stick you can find, and I will use spray adhesive to put the sandpaper on the front and back of the stick, and then I've got a stick that's got a little bit of force behind it, and I can actually get in and do this also. And again, I just make these. I just take a sheet of sandpaper, I put some spray adhesive on the back, I set the stick down, and then I take my X-Acto knife and I just cut around it. And within just a few seconds it's dry and ready to use. And I generally will have a flat end and a pointed end, like you can see on this stick. And that pointed end will let you get into those little tight areas, and it's especially useful for getting those fuzzies off of the back of a cut. So that's one thing you can use. Another thing that I'll use sometimes are these sanding blocks that you can buy, and they come in different grits. And because they're so soft and they form to the piece of wood that you're sanding, you can get into a little bit more of an uneven surface to get in there and sand those fuzzies off or to ease the edges over. So I use these quite a bit. Not uncommon that I'll get those out. I don't use these quite as much as I used to because I have power methods now that work as well, but I still do keep a few of these on hand. Another option that you can purchase are these little strips of sandpaper. They're called sand scroll, or I think they call them sand blades or scroll blades or something like that. And anyway, they have these little clips on the end of them, and you can mount this in your scroll saw, and of course it'll give you the motion to sand with. So we'll hook that up here in a few minutes and I'll show you that. That's kind of a crossover between power sanding and hand sanding, because I will sometimes just grab one of these and do a little sanding like this just manually. Another thing I use a lot are these little rat tail files, And you can pick these up at Harbor Freight or just about any hardware store. And the ones that I find really useful are the round ones, because they really let you get inside of an area and sand it, especially if you need to get inside a fairly deep cut, like if you've cut 3/4 inch thick and you need to get in there. They're really handy also when you're doing compound cutting. It really gives you a good reach to get inside of that piece of wood. Another type of sanding, if you want to call it that, are hand scrapers, and furniture makers use these all the time, and they'll give you a very, very fine cut. You just basically hold them with your fingers like this, and you bring them along the wood, and you're bringing up very small shavings off of the wood, which gives you a really smooth, nice finish. There is a drawback to these. One is you have to keep them sharp, and there's a little bit of a technique to that I won't go into, but it's something to consider, especially if you're building larger projects that have a lot of flat surfaces. These are really handy, and when I was building a lot of furniture, I used these all the time. Sanding blocks. Here's an ordinary sanding block that you can buy at almost any hardware store, and you just cut your sandpaper to fit, and they've got little clips on each end that let you raise that up and put your end of the sandpaper under it, wrap it around, and then you've got a sanding block that can take the fatigue out of your hand when you're sanding larger areas. Not particularly useful for getting into fretwork, but for larger pieces of wood, these come in pretty handy. A few months ago, I picked up a new product, and it's called the Sand Devil, and I actually did a video review on YouTube of this product also. And I like this. I use it a lot, actually more often than I really thought I would, because it's so large. You wouldn't think you would, but when I was building my wooden vases on the scroll saw, when I was writing those 2 books, I used this a lot to help sand the vases, because the nice thing about this is you've got different edges you can use. You've got this edge right here that's kind of squared off. You've got this edge that's rounded, and then you've got this edge right here that's pointed to get into smaller areas. Another thing you can do with this, a little trick, is you can take and loosen the belt, slide it over just a little bit, and you can actually use this edge with no reinforcing behind it to do some more gentle sanding. And that comes in handy when you have some burn marks on the edge of the wood. And if you've ever tried to sand those off, you know they're really difficult to get off. So you can move this belt over. It gives you a little bit of a flex right there, and you can go around those edges and get rid of those burn marks. And of course you can buy these, I bought this one on Amazon, but you can buy these and you can buy different grits of belts to go on it. And the sandpaper that comes with them is very high quality, so I use that a lot. Okay, that's pretty much hand sanding. I'm going to move on to some power sanding, and I'll show you some different tools I use. Actually, I skipped over a couple of hand sanding items that I have. I'm just going to real quick show you those. This is a box of sandpaper strips that you can buy. I bought mine at Woodcraft, and generally people that work on a lathe a lot, they use these because they can take these strips, which comes in I think 4 different grits in this pack. They can take these strips, cut them off, and then hold them against the piece while to sand it while the lathe is turning. But again, I use these because it's high quality sandpaper, and you can tear off a strip as long as you would like. You can make it like 12 inches long, and you can use it to really get a good grip around the area. Put it in your vise and move the sandpaper back and forth. Another product that I've had for a long time are these little micro sanding pads. And these sanding pads, although I don't use them real often, you can get them up to like 22,000 grit, something like that. Here's a 12,000 grit one. I think I've got a 18,000. So you can get them, this one's 600. So you can get them in all different grits. So if you really want to get an incredibly smooth, buffed out finish, this is a good place to start. Another thing that I use a lot is triple aught steel wool. And what I use this for is after I've put the spray lacquer on the piece, if that's the way I'm going to finish it, in between the first few coats, I'll take this steel wool and buff off the lacquer, because you'll find that after you spray it on the first time, you'll have a few bumps in the finish, especially if you spray it out in the area where maybe there's some dust. So in between each coat, you can take and just lightly move this steel wool across it. And then when you get done, you don't want to leave those steel wool residue on it, so you want to blow it off real good. But I do use that steel wool quite a bit. So wanted to throw that in there also. Here's a tool that just about all of you will recognize, and probably many of you have in your shop, and that's a Dremel tool. I don't use it a lot, but when you do need this kind of tool, it comes in really handy. I again will use this sometimes when I'm finishing my wooden vases. I'll use it to get into real small areas because you can get all different kinds of bits for these Dremel tools, and super handy, worth having in your scroll saw workshop to get into some of those smaller areas. Plus it has a lot of other uses too. You can put the cutting wheels on it and you know, cut metal rod or whatever you need to do with it. So worth having in your shop. A couple other products I've got here. Here are some sanding discs, and again, this is another product I did a review on a while back. And basically what it is, you can mount these into your drill press, and as you hold the piece up underneath here while it's turning, these slots that you see cut in here give you the visibility to watch the piece as you're sanding it. Haven't used them a lot yet. These were given to me for review, but the few times I have used them, I like it. They come in, I think, 3 different grits, and you can probably go back and watch that video to get a little more information about it. Okay, here's a couple of products that I actually never use, and I bought them a long time ago, so I thought I'd just show these. You can go to Kmart or Walmart, any of these places, and you can get these flap sanders, and they're very hard. And you can mount them into a drill press or a drill, or not a drill press, yeah, drill press or a drill. And these things are too aggressive for almost any kind of sanding that you would do in a scroll saw shop. So I bought these thinking they were one thing, and they were actually not what I was expecting. So if you look at these, I don't find these useful. Here's another example of that, another type of flap sander. And again, I'll show you in a little bit, I'll show you a mop sander, which is what I was actually looking for originally, but I didn't know what it was, so I was lost. But these flap sanders are just too aggressive. They might be great for stripping furniture or something like that, but they don't have much use in a scroll saw workshop. Here's another tool that a lot of you probably already have in your workshop, and that is a handheld belt sander. Now, of course, you can use this belt sander to sand down large pieces of wood, and it's a very aggressive type of sanding, so you have to be really careful with this type of sander. But what I've done here to make it a little more useful for me in my workshop, and I've had this for years, this is what I used to use before I had a larger belt sander. I actually mounted this belt sander upside down to a piece of MDF that I can then just clamp to any work table surface, and that's what I've done here. Now, if you're going to use it in this configuration, it's nice to have one that when you push on the trigger, you've got a button that you can push to lock the trigger in the on position. And it's going to be a little noisy, but I'm going to show you how this works. Again, this is a very aggressive tool. You want to get dust collection on it because you're going to take out a lot of dust. In this case, it just has a little dust bag on it, which is good for this demonstration. But if you have one, you can hook up your shop vac to even better. So this is going to be noisy, but let's start this up. And you can see there that in just a couple of passes I was able to round that corner off. And that was a lot of what I would use this belt sander in this configuration for. I would also use it to ease edges. Again, it's aggressive, so you have to go slow with it. But there's a lot of uses for an inexpensive handheld belt sander mounted upside down onto a plate. I used this a lot in the early days. Now I'm fortunate enough now to have a regular belt sander, so I don't use it anymore. But if you're on a budget and you want to have a nice little belt sander, you can use this. You can also mount it in the vertical position, but it's a little bit trickier to get it set up that way. But either way you mount it, it's pretty successful. Over here in this corner of my shop, I've got a couple of power sanding tools that I use on almost every project anyway. On my right here is a 12-inch disc sander, and this particular one's made by Rikon. It does have a dust collection port and a lot of power, so I use this tool a lot. Again, a disc sander is useful if you're rounding over the corners of a project or you're just trying to square up one edge. A lot of times I would use this tool when I was making my wooden vases also, excuse me, to flatten the bottom of the vase to make sure it's set real level. Again, a fairly aggressive tool. You can take off a lot of wood really quick, so you have to be careful with it. So this is a dedicated disc sander. Some of the disc sanders you can buy, like this one back here, which is an 8-inch disc sander, they come as a combination where they have the belt sander and the disc sander. And this is an old Craftsman that served me pretty well. I've had it for probably 8 or 10 years and never really had any trouble with it. This belt sander is set up to where you can have it vertical or horizontal. I use it in the vertical mode more often than in the horizontal mode. But again, this belt sander will take off a lot of wood really quick. It's an aggressive cutting tool, so it's not necessarily made for fret work, but for squaring up edges or rounding over corners, things like that. Both of these tools are real handy, and they get used on almost every project. Over here on this side of the shop, I have a tool that does get used an awfully lot also, and that's my Ryobi drum sander. I bought this tool probably 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, and I think since then it's been discontinued, but you can find similar units at grizzly.com or other places online. And these drum sanders come in different sizes, and you just mount the size in with the plate that fits that size inside the drum sander, and then when you start it up, you have an oscillating spindle. So you can see it moves up and down and rotates. On a lot of projects, sometimes you'll cut just outside the line to give yourself, room for error. And then what you do is you come over to your oscillating spindle sander or drum sander, and you can actually sand down to that pattern line. And it's very, very accurate. And with the different size drums, you can sand different contours. So this is a tool that I probably wouldn't be without in my shop. As a matter of fact, if this thing ever dies, I'll probably go out and buy a little nicer model. This was a surprisingly good deal. Back when this was on the market, I think it was like $130 in that range. And it's a very quality tool for that price. And I'm not saying there's not better spindle sanders out there, because there are. As a matter of fact, you can get one that's a spindle sander with a belt sander, and the belt sander also moves up and down. And that's what I'll eventually go to if I ever decide to get rid of this one. Nice tool. Here's another sanding product that I've got mounted on the end of my workbench here, and this is a tool made by King Arthur Tools, and it's called the Guinevere. And what it is a motor with a flexible shaft sander on one end and a fixed sander on the other end. And you can buy different attachments for this, including longer air-filled tubes that you can put the sandpaper on, and that's what I have right here on the end of the flexible sander. This piece right here, when you take the sandpaper off, is actually an air-filled cylinder. So when you go to sand things that are contoured, this gives a little bit and sands around the contour of what you're sanding. So it's very handy for intarsia type projects, especially if you get the larger drum. I think they make a 6-inch drum for it, and you can mount that on the stationary end and give you some pretty good use there with intarsia projects. But I used it again on my wooden vases because they're so sanding intensive. I used this a lot to take off a lot of wood on the edge of those vases, and this sped that job up a lot. If you look down here, I've got a little dust port mounted on the bottom of my workbench, and it's just a little flexible hose that I actually hook up my shop vac to. So when I use this tool, it puts off so much dust that I generally sit here just like I am right now while I'm using it. So this will be noisy again, but I'm going to turn it on and just show you how it works. So as you can see, it's a very aggressive tool. A lot of sand dust coming off there, or wood dust coming off that project as I was sanding it. That was MDF, so I especially wanted to have the vacuum going. The maybe small downside to this, again, other than the fact that it's a fairly expensive tool, is that you have to make sure you keep these drums up to the right pressure, or they won't hold the sandpaper very well. You notice that that one actually started to move on me a little bit, and if you get it bad enough, they'll actually fly off, which doesn't hurt anything. It's just a nuisance. It comes with a little hand pump that you pump these up, and pretty well have to use that hand pump every time you use it. So it's the King Arthur Tools Guinevere. Highly recommended, but it is an expensive tool. Use dust collection with it. Okay, this is probably the last tool that we'll look at here tonight, but I saved what I consider the best for last, because this is a tool, while again fairly expensive, and that was a little controversial when it first came out because people thought it was overpriced. I no longer believe that, because I've used this tool for several years now. It's never let me down, and it does the job very, very well. This tool excels for sanding fretwork, and it does it in a couple different ways. Again, when you have the back of your finished fretwork, and it can be fairly intricate fretwork, and this tool will still handle it without breaking it in most cases. I'm not saying you can't break it, but it's probably the easiest tool to use on an intricate piece of fretwork. Now, the tool in this case has one accessory on it, and this is the sanding mop that I was talking about earlier in the video. I cannot any longer live without a sanding mop. These sanding mops are like $49, depending on where you buy them. You can get them anywhere from $25 to $49, and they come in different sizes, and obviously in different grits. And what they do is they spin, and I'm going to turn it on here in a minute and give you a demonstration, and you can hold your fretwork up to it, and even on a delicate piece of fretwork, if you back it with your hand, you're generally pretty safe. The only thing about this, because it turns at a fairly high speed, every once in a while you will get a catch and it'll want to pull it out of your hand, so you do have to make sure you have a pretty good firm hold on your project when you're doing it. This gets used, I would say, every project. I use it for softening the edges of pieces, and I use it for sanding some of the back of the fretwork and sometimes even the front. That is an accessory that doesn't come with the sand flea, but it's one with the chuck that you need to buy if you have this tool, because you'll use this a lot. The other feature of the sand flea is a drum sander. And the way this is set up, you set the sandpaper at just the drum at just the right height, that when you move this across this, it's very, very delicate in as far as how it takes off a cut. It's not a very aggressive tool, and again, you can put different types or different grits of sandpaper on here, but it's delicate enough of a tool, if you have it adjusted right, that you can run fretwork across this and be very, very confident that you're not going to break it. Now, some of the early complaints about this tool was that it would leave divots in the wood because it's a drum sander that doesn't have a top drum to hold it down. And I saw that happen, and when I realized why it was happening, I decided it definitely wasn't the company's fault that makes this tool, it's the actual setup of the tool. If you have this adjusted just like they tell you to do it in the instructions, you don't get those divots. You could probably make it divot if you tried hard enough, but this is set up to where it's just barely contacting that piece of wood. As a matter of fact, the drum itself or the paper is not touching the wood. It's set up to where literally just the grit of the sandpaper is in contact with the wood. And it also comes with this fence that I believe is also, it's been a while since I purchased this, I believe this is also an accessory, and you can use the fence to actually do some edge jointing of boards. And I've used that a few times like that to really flatten out the board, and I've gotten pretty decent glue ready joints by doing that. So it does work that way. I use it primarily with the mop sander and with this. I don't use the fence that often because I've got a joiner and I don't really need it. But this is a great tool. Again, it's made by RJR Studios. It's an expensive piece of equipment, but if you can afford it, you will not regret it. I love this tool. It also has a dust collection port for your shop vac. The way you change the sandpaper is you just simply lift this lid up, and you buy the sandpaper in rolls, and you just start it at one end and feed it to the other. Simple as that. The adjustment, a little bit complicated. You have to play with it a few times to get it right. And this up here, it gives you the ability to raise and lower the table until you get it adjusted to the right height. And that part's pretty easy, but what will happen to you a lot of times is you'll get it adjusted, and this might be slightly higher than this. And that's why these thumb screws are here, and you can actually rock this back and forth a little bit and use this knob to take that out. So again, I did a complete review of this product on YouTube a few years ago, so if you're interested in this, go take a look at that. Another tool that, again, I would replace this tool tomorrow if this one stopped working. That's how much I use it. I've seen people that build these, homemade versions of these, and that's an interesting thing that I've considered a few times, because the one thing I might enjoy having is a longer roll for the sandpaper, so I can sand larger size products. This is the smaller of the two sand fleas. They do make a bigger one, and now I wish I'd have bought the bigger one, but hindsight, right? So that's probably 99% of all the sanding that I do on scroll saw projects. And you can see I've amassed a lot of different tools and products to actually sand scroll saw products. Some I use a lot, some of them I used early on a lot, and I don't use anymore. And some, you know, just never worked out for me, and I never used them at all. But the few tools that I've shown you here are tools that I've gotten pretty good use out of. I'm Steve Good. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time at the Scroll Saw Workshop.